Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And visit patreon.com/VMSPod or paypal.me/VMSPod to make a one-time or recurring donation and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. I'm posting this one kind of late on a Friday. Day job stuff just eats up Friday mornings nowadays, and there just wasn't time to get to it. But I figured it'd be good to have this podcast going into a weekend. Do keep in mind, I'm the only person who cares about the temporality of these shows, given that all of you are listening to it far later than when I actually post it. But this is just the rules-based hang-ups that devour my life. Anyway, let's get to the show. Now, my guest this time is the translator and theater director, Philip Boehm. Philip was just awarded the Helen and Kurt Wolf Prize, which is administered by our pals at the Goethe Institute, New York, for his translation of Christine Wunneke's novel, The Fox and Dr. Shimamura. That was published by New Directions last year, and it is this wonderful and bewitching book. It's the second time Philip's won the Wolf Prize, and he was actually up for it twice this year, according to the jury, for both this novel and for a translation of the novel Darkness at Noon by Arthur Koestler. We get into that translation and what it entails, but I can't do justice to The Fox and Dr. Shimamura. I enjoyed the living heck out of it. Let me just give you the prize jury's statement about it. The sly novel is both subtle and startling. A retired Japanese psychiatrist, helped, or perhaps tricked, by the 4 women in his household, is remembering, or perhaps misremembering, his younger days when he struggled to master cases of both Japanese spirit possession and Parisian hysteria under Charcot. Through all the surprising turns of the story, Wunneke conveys Dr. Shimamura's strange outer and inner life without exoticizing or over-identifying in an ironic yet compassionate authorial voice. And Philip's translation of it is wonderful, and we get into what I dug about it early in the conversation. I know this is going to sound weird, but I'm always glad to record with translators. I just find them fascinating in terms of the deep reading they have to do, the way they have to subsume themselves in favor of the author, the way they get at the spirit of a book to bring it into another tongue. They also, and this will sound weird from me, tend to have interesting lives as far as I'm concerned, and Philip's no exception. In addition to translation, he directs theater and both translates and writes plays, and he's had some fascinating travels and exposures to other cultures that help give him some perspective on our moment just now. Anyway, as caveats go, his audio level was unearthly low for some reason, so I fixed that in post-production, but it may still sound a little weird. It's a weird image for you guys to have, but during the conversation, we're talking, his voice the mic is really low. I turned up the gain a lot on my little mixing board, but I was also physically leaning in towards the monitor, even though I was wearing headphones. There's no way my physical position was going to affect things, but that's the sort of stuff well, it explains why this is an audio podcast and not video, I guess. Anyway, here's Philip's bio, where he gives some foreign names and I mangle them. Philip, starting with his last name probably, Philip Boehm's career zigzags across languages and borders, artistic disciplines and cultural divides. He is the author of more than 30 translations of prose works and plays by German and Polish writers, including Herta Müller, Franz Kafka, and Hannah Krall. For his work as a translator, he has received numerous awards, as well as fellowships from the NEA and the Guggenheim Foundation. As a director fluent in several languages, he has staged plays in Poland, Slovakia, and the U.S. His most frequent venue is Upstream Theater in St. Louis, which he founded in 2004. The company has produced dozens of works, mostly U.S. premieres, from nearly 20 different countries. Mr. Boehm's plays have been seen in Atlanta, Houston, Sacramento, St. Louis, and Banska Bystrica, Slovakia, and includes Mixtitlan, Soul of a Clone, The Death of Atahualpa, and Return of the Bedbug, as well as adaptations of Buchner's Dvorak and Kazimierz Moszarsky's Conversations with an Executioner. I was not joking about mangling those names, especially the Polish ones. For his dramatic work, Mr. Boehm has received support from the Mexican-American Fund for Culture, as well as the NEA. And now, the Virtual Memories Conversation with Philip Boehm. First, just congrats on another Helen and Kurt Wolf Prize.
Oh, well, thank you. That's very kind of you.
Yeah, I enjoyed the living heck out of the Fox and Dr. Shimomura. But I guess as an opening question, since I can only read English, I'm wondering about the flavor of the German original text, which had that sort of Japanese contour to it all, and how tough that was for you to bring it into English.
It's a book with a very
maybe I'm overthinking the entire nature.
No, I don't think you are. But it's a very wryly written book, and her sense of humor is very layered and quirky and fun. And finding that humor is first hearing it in the German is one thing, and some of that humor derives from these forays into a vision of Japan, a kind of there's a double mirror thing. There's a German or European, Western European vision of Japan, and similarly the purported Japanese vision of Western Europe back then. And she plays with this in and out of cultural stereotypes. That's very funny. But there is a lot of solid research. And what made the book particularly interesting and also posed some difficulties for the translation is how much of this is actually based in fact, in historical fact. There was this Dr. Shimomura. He was indeed a professor who had studied with Professor Sakaki. And he had indeed studied in Berlin, or he had written papers in Berlin. There is also, of course, a history of fox demon possession. And you can imagine Barbara Epler and I had a lot of fun with our fox back and forth. She even gave me a pair of fox socks at one point. But so there's a lot of research involved. And for me, trying to find those Japanese contours was a little different than it would have been had it been, say, Polish contours or some other European country, because there is a difference, and our readership has more connection to Japanese culture than a more homogeneous German readership might, right? So, I mean, we have more Japanese connections in many ways. So I was able to do certain things to substitute. For instance, the word sensei does not appear in the German, but German has has the formal and informal way of saying you. And so I was able to interpolate that in a different way that also played with that contour that you asked about.
And you mentioned humor, and this is something that's come up with the festival that Goethe Institute puts on. How difficult is humor to translate? We can get outside of the stereotype of German humor, but when it comes to the translation of humor, how challenging is it?
Well, if the humor is word-based, if it's based in puns, if we want to accept pun as humor, then of course that's a challenge right there. But certain situational humor can come through easily as long as culturally it's the society is similar enough. Um,
Mhm.
and I just translated a 19th century Polish comedy that was written in verse, and that was a challenge because the part of that particular comedy is the best known Polish comedy from in the Polish canon, and a lot of the lines have entered the everyday language in Poland, and so finding equivalents in English and making it rhyme without having to do all sorts of elbow twisting was difficult. But there were several scenes in that piece. It's a very funny farce. So scenically, it was not difficult to translate. But in this case, finding the right language was and making it rhyme. But it is hard, I think. Certain things are funny in one culture and not in another. So I don't know if I can give a blanket answer. Once I translated a book on back pain, but it was a comic book on back pain, and it was a German book German comic book on back pain, go figure, and it was written in 24 vertebral segments. And so but one of the chapters was all this East-West German humor, and that certainly wasn't going to fly. So I had to talk to the author and change that chapter. So certain contextual humor doesn't. Some contextual humor doesn't work, right? So,
I could
and
imagine.
then the political humor also sometimes, and a lot of times people think Americans aren't very interested in humor, and because we're so flat compared to a lot of cultures where they're much more out there in their daily life, joking around with each other.
I remember when I recorded with Anthea Bell about 5 years ago. For her, it was an Asterix joke that was something basically about a young Francois Mitterrand, and she had to figure out some way of conveying this character into a youthful UK audience. And
Right.
I think she considered it one of her greatest achievements is that she managed to pull off the joke. But
I can imagine she was very good at that.
Yeah. Now you mentioned in past interviews getting started in translation by accident and how that typifies a lot of people who have become translators. Do you wish you had training or had gone to some sort of program, or do you feel that you become a translator by translating?
I don't know. I imagine there are different paths, and various paths lead towards or away from translation. For me, I didn't go to a program designed in translation, but of course I was at a college where there were some rather well-known translators. I was at Wesleyan, and Krishna Winston, for instance, is a well-known translator, Jerry Winsinger, and they were professors of mine. And even though I didn't take a course in translation, I was aware of the culture of translation through them. And then when I lived in Poland in the 1980s, of course, so much of Polish literary life was based on translation. I mean, there was, on the one hand, you had this enormous body of Polish literature, which tended to be a little bit self-enclosed. And on the other hand, you had this enormous interest in literature from abroad and plays from abroad. And so there was a lot of translation going on. In those days, it was, of course, hard to obtain books because there were so many shortages in Poland in the 1980s. But there was a great interest, a very vibrant interest there was I remember this journal that would come out and people would snap it up right away. So it was very hard to get. It was called Literatura na świecie, literature on the world, world literature. And they published, that little journal published a lot of major writers from all over. So that sense of translation as a living a living body of work on its own, uh, and not relegated to some category just of serving this particular work. That was a little more present in Poland in those days, and I think that for that reason too, I was more aware of what went into translating. But yes, it was by accident that I got started, and I never foresaw doing this professionally. So.
Hmm. I want to focus on the Poland, or the what that era meant, given that we are potentially heading into martial law here in the U.S. But
Yeah,
also
yes.
and we'll talk about that. Trust me. But that question of, well, did that era instill a sense of almost responsibility about translation to you? That sense that, it's a necessity to bring works from other languages into these cultures?
I would say
Something that you
more.
sort of,
What
yeah.
an excellent question. I would say more broadly that era instilled a sense of significance to the arts in me. It was already part of my upbringing, but it became a more vital presence, and I felt that it was a more vital part of society for those experiences that I saw. For instance, I remember I used to go to the Philharmonic on occasion. I was invited to this great performance of Brahms' Third Symphony, conducted by Celibidache, who had come in from Munich at that time, and that was a big deal. And afterwards, my friend invited me over, as one does in after a Brahms Third in Warsaw on a cold and rainy night, for a little vodka, and it was an afternoon concert. So I had a little vodka, and then I don't know, later 7 or 8 in the evening, I was walking by the Philharmonic, and there was a small crowd of people gathered outside the side entrance to the Philharmonic, and they had been waiting there in that weather just to applaud Maestro Celibidache when he exited. And
Wow.
and people would line up for theater tickets. I mean, you couldn't get anything in the stores, but they would go to the theaters, they would buy the books. There was a, a big black market in certain books, and rather unsavory types would raid the libraries, steal books from the library, and sell them on the market and at the flea market. And there were all sorts of things like that happening. But the arts were so vibrant, and I think partly because of the material shortages, there was a spiritual need. And at the same time, you had a lot of you had an upsurge in um, official spiritual business with the Pope and everything. But beyond that, there was just this vibrancy. I keep coming back to that word, of the arts in those days, and I think that
Mm.
that had a huge impact on me, both in my theater work and also in my recognition of uh, literature broadly and translation specifically.
What brought you to Poland?
Ah, well, I had been in a program. I had been in a PhD program in German literature, but I realized that that was not my calling, and
Mm.
I I had done some theater on the side, but I wanted to learn another language. I wanted to learn either Polish or Portuguese, and it it wound up being Polish. And I applied to a theater program in not knowing whether I had any chance of getting in, not knowing whether I would be accepted. It was just when I applied, it was still martial law. I had no idea what what might await me. I had also met Elżbieta Skłodowska, who later became a couple, and that was further reason to be in there, to go to Poland. I was interested in switching to theater, and the Polish theater at the time was very, very alive, and but I had no idea whether I would be able to, to study there. And lo and behold, they offered me a, a, a discounted kind of scholarship, if you, because they said this was for how did they put it? There was some term. They made me a Polish. It was as though I were of Polish heritage, and they gave me some special.
Legacy.
Yeah, like I'm not though, but it's it's kind of funny.
Yeah.
But I got into this program, and I had to study Polish culture and language first, and then I was accepted into this directing as a directing fellow in this Academy of Theater, and so that's the backstory there.
And where did theater begin for you? And we'll get into the fact that you're also a director on top of being a translator, or next to being a translator. But yeah, I'm curious as to where theater began and how it interacts with the other
theater,
literary aspects of your.
I had no background in theater in high school or anything. I was interested in it, and at Wesleyan, I got interested in theater more, and at that time I was also reading a lot of plays in German. My first experience with theater was actually in German, because there was a course at Wesleyan taught by Jerry, we call him Jerry Arthur Wenzinger. And in that course, it was an experimental thing at the time. Now it's done everywhere, but we were putting on a play in German, and the German department there was very strong, and there were enough students, and there were some very good actors who could speak German at Wesleyan. And lo and behold, I was cast in this part as a freshman, and that was my first real experience with theater. But interestingly, it was in German.
Which, I mean, you could speak fluently at the time, right?
I could, yes, I could.
Oh, good. Just making sure it wasn't a lip syncing virtual.
No. That'd be funny.
So that's something. But I guess that sort of feeds the question of, you translate books, obviously, but also you translate for the stage. And, which one's, I don't want to say easier, but, what do you prefer? What's are there challenges inherent in one that's absent from the other?
Yeah, they're very different things. Of course, a play is meant to be seen and experienced, and the action is passing in front of you, and you can't stop and go back and reread the page. You have to, so it keeps going. So if an audience member misses something, then there's no way that they can, they're just going to be lost.
Yeah. There's no rewind. Yeah.
There's no rewind. So for that reason, translating, there are certain things that we have to unclutter to make the story more clear, perhaps, or to emphasize. Sometimes it means losing one thing, because in the translation, if you try to hold on to these double meanings, one of them might be more important than the other for the action on the stage. Whereas in a prose book, you can play with that a little more. You can find ways to get those shades across in another sentence, say, or breaking it up. But translating a play requires a different type of focus, I think. As for preference, I enjoy translating for the stage. I don't get too many commissions to do that. I do it when there's a play I'm interested in directing. Occasionally, I do it as for other reasons, but it's mostly plays that I'm interested in directing myself. And in that case, of course, I have an added reason to do it. Sometimes the prose, that depends on what the book is. I'll tell you, a book I really enjoyed translating was The Flower Ball, which is a children's book. And I got to write things like, the vegetables are on one side of the garden and the flowers are on the other. The flowers are giving a ball. The vegetables aren't invited. But cauliflower and carrot are determined to crash that ball anyway. And so they go. And how could you do that? Snapped the pea. That kind of line was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Nice. It's going to be sort of a meta question, but is staging something translation in and of itself, regardless of the original language?
Absolutely. And
okay. I know that's sort of a feeder question for you, but is that something that, yeah.
Yeah. And you see, I've riffed on that before, and it's very much so. And, we're always both, as a director, I'm taking a text and putting it into another place. I'm taking it from the page and putting it onto the stage. And as a translator, I'm taking a text and putting it in a different place. And in each case, I have to hear /envision what that original text is. And then I have to distill that into something else. And I think musicians, conductors, these are all examples of similar work. Similar processes. But for me, there's a lot of overlap because, especially when I'm thinking concretely as a director or as a playwright, even more, the envisioning where is this scene taking place. So in the Fox and Dr. Shimomura, I looked at a lot of structures, houses, Japanese houses, to try and envision what that window paper might have looked like, that's described in the first few pages of that book. And I tried to get a sense in my head, the topography of his house, and that required, detailed reimagining. That's something I do when I'm directing plays all the time.
Do you find audiences more receptive to translated plays than to books in translation? That comes from Tess Lewis, actually, because I hit her up to see if she had any questions, and that was one that jumped out.
I think it's the database is so it's too insignificant to make a statement. There are so few translated plays being done, and when they are done, they're done in little theaters like the one I run. But also a book, a translated book may not have a large print run, but it's going to be picked up by a few people in cities all across the nation. But if you miss that production, we just did a production of the English language premiere of Wildfire by David Paquet, who is a Québécois writer from Montreal. And if you miss that production, that little production in St. Louis, you're unlikely to ever see it unless by chance some other theater picks it up. But even so, that's going to be another small theater. So I don't know about receptivity. I can say quantity of reception. The book's going to have a lot greater readership. The audience loved that play. So it's kind of apples and oranges.
Sure. Understood. And I don't think she was asking in any thought of maybe I should move into theater instead of prose, but
you can tell Tess that it's pomme, it's pomme or pomme de terre. we could go there. But no,
And she was,
no, it's
yeah,
very funny. She's fun.
yeah, she was one of the last people I got to record with before the world
Oh,
went sideways.
oh,
Yeah.
that's great. But she's so nice. I really, she's great. She's great.
Yeah, I drove up to her place, recorded with her, and then Alta Price. Then I
Oh,
did two more that weekend, and then the world shut down, and I've been reduced to hanging out in my library with a microphone.
so Tess and Alta, you just saw recently. Then that's great. That's great.
Well, recently was first week of March,
Uh-huh.
so yeah,
But
drove up to
is
Bronxville,
Alta is living outside of the city, right?
Chicago.
Yeah,
She's in Chicago. She was in New York for FNL work
right,
with the Goethe Institute, and
right.
at the time we were making contingency plan. We were talking about the contingency plans if the German language authors weren't allowed to fly to the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
That was like March 5th, and a week later,
right,
it was none of us are going anywhere. It's time to hide, and
right.
Yeah.
I see.
It was quite a difference. But before we get into pandemic world, I do want to ask, Polish or German, just in general, is one easier to bring into English than the other, or is it really contingent on your skill and the authors you're working with?
Well, they're so different. German, I envision the German language as like a big Lego set where there's these component parts and you can take them apart and put them together and this all kind of fits in neatly, or at least with a lot of right angles. And Polish the Slavic languages have all these declensions that are different than the Lego type declension, and the verbs have aspects which are also different than simple tense variations. So they're just differently constructed languages, and for that reason, I think they tend to do certain things really well, different things well. Polish also sounds. I've used the word autumnal rustling of the language to describe Polish because there's all this is a Polish tongue twister, and that sometimes, since hearing the language is so much part of translating, trying to get, when you encounter authors who make use of that, the best authors are making the best use of their language and trying to reproduce that sense of you can't quite capture the same rustling sounds in English, but you can get a rhythm that might evoke that. And German is closer to our culture. German is closer to our language. So it's a slightly different distance. The Polish has to travel a little further than German. That doesn't make it necessarily harder or easier. That always depends on the book. I think the book that was the most difficult for me to translate was probably Gregor von Retzori, just because his erudition was vast and he put it on full display in lots of digressive chapters, and that required just a ton of research.
And I know you said at the time Portuguese was the 2A language that you chose between with Polish, but if you could pick another language, just a third language you would mysteriously just be able to translate in now,
well,
would it still be Portuguese? Or
I had an opportunity to be in Brazil for a couple of months, thanks to the Sakata Foundation a couple of years ago, and that's still very high on the list. So,
yeah.
And I grew up hearing Spanish, and I'm not grammatically correct in Spanish by any means, but I do have a sense of I can defend myself in Spanish, and I can even translate certain things. Plays I can translate mostly if it's Latin American Spanish,
Yeah.
but there's a long way to go for the Portuguese yet.
When it comes to the books that you translate, do you prefer working on living authors or dead? You've done canonical work like Kafka and Kessler. What do you prefer, I guess, or is it again a case by case?
It's a case by case. I mean, I've been very fortunate to work with some authors, some living authors who are just wonderful to work with. And I mean, Christoph Hind, for instance, is just an amazing guy. Helter Miller is great. These people I've been able to meet, who several of whom have become friends. I feel so fortunate to have been able to translate their work and then to get to know them somewhat. And it's also sometimes it's not just the author, but it's people who are involved with that author. The publishers, the other translators. These are living worlds, and that of course is fun. So obviously with an author who is no longer with us, there's not the same back and forth that you can have. You can imagine a situation, and I have had this too, where a living author might suddenly decide that they know English, and and they might intervene a little bit. I have been very fortunate because that's happened exceedingly seldom in my translation career.
Does befriending the authors help at all with subsequent works of theirs? Just in terms of, as you get to know them, you can intuit a little better certain aspects of their prose? Yes,
I think it does. There can also be a difficulty because you might, an author. I'm not the one who chooses to publish the book,
Sure.
And so authors then send me, having translated one book. Well, don't you want to translate this other book? And then I have to say, well, that would be. I might, but not. I don't necessarily. Not all of their books are equally interesting, and not all of their books can travel as well. So sometimes it's a little awkward because I just have to be cognizant that some of the don't understand the system of publishing in the U.S. and so there's a lot of potential expectation that has to be.
In those cases, you can always fall back on, I would love to do this, but the publisher is just not interested. You can always, dropping blame on other people is the American way. Really.
Yeah, that is, isn't it? Isn't it? Yes.
And that's translation right there.
There we go.
Do you feel pressure though with canonical works? Like when you're redoing or doing that, I will say alternate version of Darkness at Noon or translating Kafka or others, does the canonicity make it a more fraught process, or?
It does make it a more fraught process, and I worry. I try not to. In those cases, especially where there are existing, well-known existing translations, I try not to. I don't read them. I put them out of my head, and in fact, with the Kafka, I was deterred from doing something that now I rather regret having been deterred because it would have been fun. It was one of my first, I think my second translation contract, and there I was in Poland I was sending material back by courier, if you will, by secret courier, because I didn't trust the mails, and so I would go to the airport and find someone who was on one of these strange charter flights to the United States, and I someone who would look reliable, and I would have ask them to put this in the mailbox that had stamps. And for a while, that's how I was sending material to Sarah Burstell. But the at one point, I was frustrated with the situation of the back and forth, and I wrote this letter allegedly by Kafka to Milena, in which he's talking about, because she was his translator. And so in this letter, I wrote, "Dear Frau Milena, you're up so late with translating these words of mine, and you get paid so poorly for it. And why don't you see this?" And I did this whole thing, and I sent it to the editor and publisher, and actually they didn't catch it. The copy editor didn't catch it. Nobody caught it. And I had even these clues because it was like April 1, 1922 or something. And they did catch it. And finally, in a moment of weakness, I suppose, or wariness, or simple fear, I asked the copy editor, I said, "Ed, could you," and by the way, Ed Cohen, brilliant copy editor, "could you look at this again?" And there was this groan when he realized what it was. And I said, "So here's the question. Do I continue to keep this in the book, or do we take it out of the book?" And he said, "It's Kafka. There's this estate and everything. I really think you ought to tell Sarah." And Sarah Burstell, who is the best editor, and there was a similar groan that she hadn't caught it either. And but so it didn't get in the letters to Milena, but I have a copy of it somewhere.
It would have been funny if there were just, like 5 copies of it that were printed with that, and the rest didn't have it. Which
that would be very funny. That would have been hilarious. Yeah,
that'd be the Kafka meets Borges sort of thing. But
exactly. That's right. Well, then later, I saw Ed a couple of years ago, and he said, "I regret. You should have done it." So
yeah,
but anyway, but there's that pressure. Yes.
How are you dealing with we'll go with pandemic world first before we get to racial protest world that we're now in. How has the last couple of months been for you?
Well, so,
and you're in Texas, which is very different than New Jersey, where I'm
exactly. I was going to ask, and I'm assuming that you've been healthy all this time, and
yeah, I've managed to avoid human contact for outside of my wife. I haven't had like an in-person conversation with someone in over 2 months. So
right, I see. Right. It is different here, of course. From the point of view of translating, we work alone. We work at home or in an office somewhere, so there's some sense of solo work already in that. Of course, theater is another matter. There is no theater right now. All I can do is plan things and I'm working on a play that I hope we will be able to produce at some point in the future. There's another twist to this for me personally, because my father, whom I've been helping for the past several years, and who is 101 years old, he had a stroke a few months ago, and so I have been navigating the healthcare system a bit, hospital, nursing home, back and forth, and so there's an added weight there, and I'm just there's a sense of double isolation. Until recently, I was unable to visit him. At present, he's in the hospital, and I'm able to, ironically, because he had to go to the hospital for something, and they just, for the past 3 days, I've been able to visit him. They here in Houston. So for me, that's not his hospitalization is not COVID related. But of course, being in the Texas Medical Center, which is this huge, it's probably the largest medical center in the world, and it's amazing. But there's so much presence of the pandemic magnified by that setting. Um, so so that's what it's like for me, the pandemic area. Um,
Yeah, it's one of those. Throughout this process, I've been doing daily podcasts with past guests to check in on them, see how things are going, and most of them are New York, Northeast
mhm,
area. And then I had this one author down in Austin
mhm.
who was talking about doing a road trip up to Iowa to see his parents, and I was like, I can't even conceive. This is April. I'm like, I can't conceive of
Right,
doing that. Like where I
right,
am, if we go to
right,
another state and they see New Jersey plates on my car, they're just going to start shooting at me and
right, right,
tell
right,
me to
right,
keep going. But
right, right.
yeah,
Well, the governor here for a while, any traffic coming from Louisiana had to self quarantine.
yeah,
For the law for a while. So,
yeah. But to be honest, that's advisable anyway. I'm just kidding. My wife's
yeah.
people are from Louisiana, so I always,
Yeah, that might be advisable, unless they're carrying great gumbo.
yeah, or they're bringing crawfish.
There we go.
Um, but it's to get back to Poland. Um, living in Poland under martial law,
Yeah,
what?
I wasn't there. I came there just after they had lifted martial law, but the
Okay,
shortages were still there was still rationing and all of that stuff.
okay, because I was going to ask, like, how much of what's going on in America today, resonates with you based on your Iron Curtain experience in the 80s.
The Iron Curtain experience in the '80s, and I saw um, the riot police break up demonstrations with clubs and shields and all of that. And these riot police were recruited largely from small towns of the countryside, and they were drugged up, given vodka or whatever, and they there was no um, it was primitive enforcement, if you will, and the the ideological basis for it was that of a party trying to maintain its grip on power, a party that had no mandate with the people, a party that had at one point showed signs of opening up, and then when in the eyes of the people running the party, that opening went too far, and in the eyes of the Soviets, then that resulted in this uh, seizure of power by Jaruzelski. But all of that was in the name of a party, and as bankrupt as the party was ideologically, there was at some point an ideology behind it. And here we have a demagogue. We have a demagogue who is feeding all sorts of populist resentment and fueling this these these tensions in a way that I think are it functions very differently. Um, it's the brutality, though,
Mm.
the quick reach for the riot police gear is, and then the militarization of things. It was all, in Poland back then that was expected, but because the whole country had been in martial law, but here it's so antithetical to what we think of as our American way of life, and and for that reason, it's perhaps all the more frightening. And the fact that it could come this far is 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 so frightening. And the fact that there's so many politicians who have demonstrated nothing but fecklessness in the face of this demagoguery. And that's what I think. My father, who is, he's still very mentally alert, and he's astounded at the goings on, and he doesn't. I think for him, he just doesn't. He doesn't understand the likes of a Mitch McConnell, and
Yeah.
he's like, they asked him in the hospital when he had a stroke. They asked these questions like, well, do you know what day it is? Do you know what week it is? Do you know who the president is? And he goes, Trump, jackass. And he's kind of like, go, Dad. It's like that's,
Yeah.
And so for someone, and listening to his perspective with all of those years and having seen so much, and been in the war and everything, it just shows how far the discourse has deteriorated. It's astounding. But yeah, there are sometimes there's just overlaps that are that make Poland look better.
Yeah, it's sort of wondering, given the on the ground experience, knowing that it was 30 plus years ago. But when I did one with Harold Bloom back in the beginning of 2016, and he was scared of Trump then, thought it was a strong possibility. I laughed at him at the time. He was quoting Sinclair Lewis at me, and I just thought, oh, he's being alarmist. But turns out that Harold Bloom was a smart guy.
Well, I remember being shocked that when Reagan was elected and thinking this is the end, and those were the days, right?
Yeah. Well, that's the line the thing that struck me when I was watching Bruce Springsteen in that live theater thing that he did in Broadway, he did his 9/11 song, and I had this weird epiphany that for everything we revile George W. Bush over, and as terrible as that 8 years was, he actually had a progressive view of mankind that weirdly informed it.
Yes.
Execution was terrible, the corruption, etc. But there was the idea that if we bring democracy to these people, it'll improve their lives and make for a more peaceful world. There was actually like this positive impression of mankind, where this just looks like a nihilistic, crime-ridden free-for-all. But
it might have been there was an inherent paternalism in that regime that manifested itself in different ways. But even so, exactly what you're saying, there was a belief in some type of progress and moving uplifting people.
Yeah. It's weird. And we're not going to look fondly back on that time, although
but nevertheless, it's better. Yeah.
It's again, context and history change things a lot for us.
Exactly.
But Tess's other question about this was, she wrote in an email to me this morning, poetry in the theater played an important role in affecting change in Poland. Can literature of any genre play an effective role in bringing about change in the U.S.? We know people will watch anything on Netflix, but, that doesn't necessarily count.
Right. Although I think that I think Spike Lee's films, for instance, can move people to act and so yeah, so Netflix film streaming is one thing. Poetry, the reason poetry and theater played such a role in in Poland had to do with what I was talking about before. I mean, that's, the people were very um, thirsty.
Yeah.
They had a spiritual thirst, and they looked to, and there was a tradition also, because of so they were so long without a national, they were so long under uh, occupation, or ruled by different, countries, and there was such a history of rebellion and trying to preserve the national identity, and that was encoded in uh, poetry and in theater and in verse drama. So even when during the World War II, they had underground schools in Poland, and Polish officers in a prison camp in Germany would memorize uh, entire works uh, in of the canon, um,
Mm-hmm.
and so there was this kind of symbolic value, and the Poles are big on symbols, and uh, we are we don't have that background here. Theater has never been. I mean, theater was an import for so long. It's only, just really starting with O'Neill, I think that our that American theater started to, and it's not, people aren't, unlike in Warsaw in 1968, all of the what happened then, there were demonstrations and a crackdown, and that resulted in an anti-Semitic wave within the party. Um, that was all set off by a theater performance, and
Hmm.
that's not, there might be some incident that would happen at the theater here, but it's not going to change. Um, this is this is a subject, as you can imagine, close to my heart. So what can it do? What I hope, in our little theater in St. Louis, if someone comes in and is moved, our motto is we want to move you and move you to think, but you have to move people and move them to think. And if someone comes into the theater and sees something that makes them think a little differently, or alerts them to something, or upsets them enough to consider a different angle, then that's probably all we can expect the theater to do here. And poetry, um, it's, I think the people who read, my father incidentally attributes his advanced years to red wine and reading poetry all the time. Um,
Yeah.
and that the people um, who read poetry, who write poetry, um, they're probably already, um, they're not the ones who need to
Yeah. Preaching to
change.
the converted. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Yeah. Um, I wonder if Tess feels that, since she also translates from French, I wonder if she feels that because there's a certain French uh, aesthetic that is more clearly, the aesthetic stance is more politicized in France. And I wonder if she feels that the aesthetic uh, whether aesthetics can, can we shift the national aesthetic in such a way, if there even
Yeah.
is a national aesthetic, which I don't think there is, like there is in France, but that'd be a
Yeah.
question.
And that's, again, you may be victim of our diversity in a sense.
Right, right.
Yeah. Although you're
Exactly.
giving me this great idea, now that all I can do is these remote podcasts, I don't see why I'm not just getting like you and Tess and other people onto a single single session and having everybody just kind of roundtable it. But
that's a
it's kind of neat getting good ideas and innovating in the middle of pandemic world. Book you have translated that you wish more people were reading, regardless of how much your royalties would be for it.
Yes.
One thing that you would just love to see, break out.
Maybe Chasing the King of Hearts is one. I mean, there are a lot of them. I mean, because Herta Miller won the Nobel Prize, so she's known. But I think Hannah Krall's Chasing the King of Hearts hasn't gotten the attention that it might deserve. Another book that came out years and years ago, ahead of its time, as it were, Damascus Nights by Rafi Chiami, which is also just a very pleasant book to read. It's a very kind book, and there's layers of kindness, and it's a book about storytelling, and it's set in Damascus in the late 50s, and with Nasser and all of that. But Rafi Chiami, who was born there and had to immigrate to Germany for political reasons when he was young, is a master storyteller, and it's a book that's storytelling about storytelling. But there are all these. It's a very easy book to read, and at the same time, it's quite nuanced. And the humor that you asked about at the top of our discussion. There is a lot of humor in the setup of the book, and that was fun to translate. It was also excruciating to translate because there was all these sights and smells and tastes, and I was so hungry translating that book.
Yeah. I have to look it up.
Yeah.
Now, the question I usually in this period have been closing out with is there a place that you want to go, that would sort of symbolize that we're past pandemic life, or, is it just being back in your theater in St. Louis and seeing an audience there and putting on a play?
Seeing an audience in the theater would be a great place to go. That would be
we'll leave you with that.
Yeah.
My other thing is the Wolf Prize like the NBA Coach of the Year, where you can't win back-to-back years, or are you still in the running for the next year's one too?
Actually, I didn't even know I was eligible to win it a second time. That's a fairly new possibility, and I don't think that I would be eligible. I don't think you could win it back-to-back years. I doubt that they would be that inclined anyway. But
it's all politics, I tell you.
Anyway. Yeah, yeah. It could be. But no, I feel very humbled because I know that I've sat on a lot of juries. I know what that work is, and I feel very grateful and humbled to have been awarded that a second time. It's almost unbelievable. So that was quite a nice surprise in this rather bleak in these bleak months.
And I'm just happy that they connected me with you. They got me the Fox and Dr. Shimamura, because the last trip my wife and I got to take before everything went sideways was Japan, and obviously a very different Japan than the one that's rendered in the novel, but it's still.
Oh, that's wonderful.
It just evoked,
And is that where?
It was
where
that
would
moment
you?
of, oh my God.
Where would you? What place would you head for?
Well, this is something I've said in my if I could just be sitting across a table from somebody recording a conversation, I'd be ecstatic.
That's brilliant.
Doesn't matter where it is.
Great. That's great. Well,
I'm like Diogenes with a couple of microphones. That's I'm just out searching for conversation. The idea that I could sit across a table, not worry about our health, and just have a conversation is what I'm looking forward to. So I'm hoping you and I are able to do that in the future.
And not have anyone over
my
a barrel.
My family lives in St. Louis also, so
that's
I'm
great.
hoping.
Then you have to come to a show, and when we have that open, and with Barbara Epler, it was in person, right? When you interviewed Barbara, that's great.
We met at the New Directions offices on a Saturday, and then I got to rampage and raid the extras shelves. Which
that's great. She is so lovely.
Wow.
Know. Okay. Well, thank you so much.
And that was Philip Boehm. He doesn't seem to have a website or a social media presence, which probably explains his productivity pretty well. He has translated dozens of books, most recently, and you should check out, The Fox and Dr. Shimamura from New Directions Publishing. The author is Christine Wunicke, and that's Wunnicke. Philip's name is Philip with one L, and Boehm, Boehm. And there'll be links to all this stuff in the show and episode notes for this one. But The Fox and Dr. Shimamura is a gorgeous and weird book, and reminded me, even though it takes place 100 years ago, reminded me of that trip I took to Japan last February and the alienness of being there. Anyway, I've already ordered the other ones that Philip mentioned at the end of our conversation, Damascus Nights and Ermine and Chernopol and Chasing the King of Hearts. Maybe after November, I'll get his translation of Darkness at Noon, too. Now, the Upstream Theater in St. Louis is upstreamtheater.org. Theater is with an ER at the end. It's also on Twitter as Upstream Theater and Instagram as Upstream Theater STL for St. Louis. And thanks again to the Goethe Institute for bringing us together. I am awfully glad to get to do stuff like this with them. Now, in the before time, this is when I would mention my Patreon and PayPal, but we're living in a different world now. I'm doing just fine. My job is paying me pretty well. How it treats me is a different thing entirely. But anyway, there are other people who are really in need right now. There are artists, writers, institutions. Go find the Patreons, GoFundMes, Kickstarters, Indiegogos, tip jars, whatever, for those entities, and show them some support. And if you're not comfortable giving to individuals, there are plenty of worthwhile charities out there. As far as the pandemic goes, things like food banks can really use your help. There are other ways to help people in need. On top of that, there's a whole ton of people who are going to need bail money and attorney's fees and other funds because they were flexing their right to peaceful assembly and got rumbled by the cops. So you should look into the various freedom funds and other ways of contributing to the cause. There's a lot of people and causes who can use a hand right now, so if you're in a position to help, then please help them. I will say, not asking for money, but I have started mailing out copies of my very first zine, Haiku for Business Travelers, which is a special gift for my patrons, but also to past guests and other people who are pals of mine. If you want that, just drop me a line or visit haikuforbusinesstravelers.com and hit me up that way. There's a link there so you can kick in a few bucks for postage and production if you want. But honestly, this is not a money-making thing. This is me sharing my art, such as it is. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.